Some people think the biggest mistake you can make on a farm is planting at the wrong time. They're wrong. The biggest mistake is assuming private property is just an empty shortcut. My name is Nathan Cole, and 21 days before a white luxury SUV buried itself axle deep in a ribbon of rain-soaked mud, I was standing beside a brand-new drainage trench with a steaming cup of black coffee in one hand and a county inspection report in the other. The flashing amber barricade lights reflected off the wet ground while dawn settled over my family's farm, and the only sound was the steady chorus of tree frogs welcoming another spring morning in southern Missouri. The trench stretched nearly 300 feet along the eastern edge of my soybean field, exactly where generations of runoff had always collected after heavy rain. It wasn't a trap. It wasn't revenge. It was the same drainage improvement I'd spent 6 months planning with the county, complete with permits, survey stakes, reflective warning signs, and bright orange barriers that anyone paying the slightest attention could see from hundreds of feet away. Yet less than an hour later, half the county would be watching an expensive SUV sitting hopelessly in thick brown mud, while its owner insisted someone else should be blamed for a decision she made all by herself. Looking at that scene, you'd probably think the story started with the trench. It didn't. It started with a shortcut. My grandparents bought this farm in 1968, long before luxury subdivisions and neighborhood associations reached our corner of the county. Back then, the eastern ridge overlooked nothing but hay fields, cattle fences, and winding gravel roads. My father used to tell me that land remembers every footprint, every tire track, every fence post, and every promise made to protect it. When I inherited the property 12 years ago, I promised I'd leave it healthier than I found it. That's why every fence line was repaired before harvest, every drainage ditch stayed clear, and every acre had a purpose. Farming isn't just planting seeds and hoping for sunshine. It's reading the ground like an old friend, knowing where water wants to travel before the clouds even gather. That's probably why I noticed the first fresh tire marks before anyone else would have. They cut diagonally across the edge of my north field, flattening young soybean shoots that had barely broken through the soil. At first I figured someone got lost. It happens. I filled the ruts, replanted the damaged section, and moved on. 2 mornings later the tracks came back. Then again. Then every weekday around 8:15, right after the neighborhood traffic backed up near the elementary school. Whoever was driving had discovered that crossing my property shaved almost 4 minutes off the commute. 4 minutes for them. Weeks of extra work for me. The smell of crushed soybean leaves mixed with damp earth every time I walked that corner, and every fresh set of tracks felt like another sentence written across land my family had spent decades protecting. That's when I met Brenda Whitmore. You could hear her before you saw her. The quiet countryside would suddenly fill with the low growl of an oversized Cadillac Escalade rolling across ground that had never been intended for anything heavier than a tractor. She dressed like every errand deserved a charity gala, bright designer scarves, oversized sunglasses, polished jewelry catching the morning sun, and enough confidence to convince herself that every gate existed for someone else. She didn't slow down when she crossed the field. She waved. The first time she smiled through her open window and called out, "I'm just borrowing a little space, sweetheart." Then she drove away before I could answer, leaving another pair of muddy tracks behind her. I watched the dust settle across my young crop, took one slow sip of coffee, and quietly decided I was going to solve this the right way, no matter how long it took. Nobody understands how personal a few tire tracks can become until they appear in the exact same place every single morning. I started documenting everything because memories fade, but photographs do not. Every sunrise I walked the eastern edge of the farm with the same stainless steel travel mug in one hand and my phone in the other. The air smelled like damp grass and fresh earth, meadowlarks perched on the old cedar fence posts, and the first rays of sunlight usually painted the soybean field a soft shade of green that reminded me why I never traded this life for an office. Then I would find another fresh set of oversized tire marks pressed deep into the soil, curving across the field like someone had signed their name where crops should have been growing. At first I calculated the damage only in dollars. Then I realized it was costing me something much harder to replace. Every pass compacted the soil enough to reduce drainage, forcing me to rework the ground before the next rain. Every flattened row delayed new growth. Every morning started with repairs instead of progress. My father always believed that when something keeps happening, it is because someone believes there will never be consequences. Those words echoed through my mind every time I filled another rut with a shovel. After the fourth week, I installed 2 trail cameras on oak trees overlooking the crossing. They were weatherproof, motion-activated, and pointed in opposite directions so nothing could slip through unnoticed. I did not hide them. I wanted them to be seen because my goal was never to catch someone by surprise. My goal was to convince them to stop. Instead, the cameras recorded the same white Escalade crossing my field every weekday morning with remarkable consistency. 8:14, 8:16, 8:15. It was almost as reliable as sunrise. Brenda never hesitated. She drove across my property with one hand on the steering wheel and the other wrapped around an oversized coffee cup as though she was cruising through a neighborhood park instead of somebody else's livelihood. One Tuesday, I stepped into her path before she reached the fence opening. She lowered her window halfway, expensive perfume drifting out into the cool country air while her oversized sunglasses reflected my own irritated expression back at me. I stayed calm. I introduced myself properly, explained that the land was private property, and pointed toward the county road less than a quarter-mile away. I even mentioned that the shortcut was damaging newly planted crops. She smiled with the kind of confidence that comes from never expecting to hear the word no. She told me everyone used that route now because it was easier, then casually suggested that I should be grateful my land was helping the community. Before I could answer, she rolled the window up and continued across the field, her tires throwing damp dirt behind her. 2 days later, I found wooden survey stakes snapped in half near the crossing. Those stakes marked a future drainage improvement that had already been reviewed by the county engineering office. Replacing them took less than an hour, but seeing them broken told me something important. This was no longer about convenience. Someone had decided my boundaries were optional. I contacted the county sheriff's office, not because I wanted anyone arrested, but because I wanted advice. The deputy who stopped by walked the property with me, examined the camera footage, and nodded thoughtfully. He explained that repeated trespassing documentation would strengthen any future civil claim, especially if property damage continued. He also recommended clearly visible warning signs before taking additional legal steps. That afternoon, I installed 4 new signs along the eastern boundary. Each one read private property, no vehicle access. They were bright, reflective, and impossible to miss unless someone had already decided not to look. Standing there with my post driver resting against my shoulder, I hoped those signs would be the end of the story. Farms have enough challenges without turning neighbors into opponents. I wanted peaceful mornings again. I wanted to hear birds instead of engines. But deep down, I had the uneasy feeling that Brenda Whitmore had spent too many years mistaking politeness for permission, and people who confuse those two things rarely change course after a single warning. The warning signs lasted exactly one morning before somebody decided they were decorations instead of instructions. When I reached the eastern boundary at sunrise the next day, one of the reflective signs was leaning sideways in the grass. Another had muddy tire marks running directly over its metal post, and fresh tracks cut straight through the same section of young soybeans I had replanted less than a week earlier. The smell of damp soil mixed with the faint scent of gasoline hanging in the cool spring air, and I could actually trace Brenda's route without looking at the camera footage because the flattened plants formed a perfect diagonal line across the field. It was almost impressive how precisely she followed the same path every single morning. Later that afternoon, I received an envelope in my mailbox with the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association logo printed across the top. I almost laughed because my farm had never been part of their subdivision, and I had never signed a single document giving that association authority over my property. Inside was a polite-sounding letter claiming that my fence line and warning signs created what they called an unnecessary inconvenience for neighborhood traffic. They suggested opening a permanent access lane through my eastern field to improve community travel efficiency. They even included a proposed maintenance agreement offering to spread gravel over the route at some future date, as though paving over my crops would somehow become a favor. Reading those pages felt stranger than finding tire tracks. Someone had actually convinced themselves that my family's farmland had quietly become public infrastructure simply because they found it convenient. I called the number listed on the letter, hoping there had been some misunderstanding. Brenda answered with cheerful confidence before I even finished introducing myself. She explained that several homeowners appreciated the shortcut and believed it benefited everyone. I reminded her that private property rights did not disappear because enough people liked using someone else's land. She paused just long enough to let out a small laugh before telling me that progress always required compromise. I thanked her for her time, ended the conversation politely, and immediately saved the voicemail. She left an hour later repeating the same position. Documentation had become my new morning routine. A few evenings later, I drove past the subdivision clubhouse after picking up irrigation supplies in town. The parking lot was full, so I guessed the monthly homeowners association meeting had just ended. As I waited at a nearby stop sign, several residents walked toward their vehicles, and I overheard one man mention the shortcut across my farm. Another replied that Brenda said the owner was eventually going to cooperate anyway. Hearing those words settled something in my mind. This was no longer one driver's bad habit. It had become a story being repeated often enough that people accepted it as fact. The following week, traffic increased. Not by much, but enough for my cameras to capture 3 additional vehicles following Brenda's tire marks. Most turned around after seeing the signs. One pickup crossed halfway before backing out. Brenda never hesitated. She led by example, and unfortunately her example encouraged others to ignore boundaries they would have respected anywhere else. I spent an entire Saturday repairing compacted soil with a field cultivator while the steady hum of the engine echoed across the valley. Every pass loosened ground that should never have been compressed in the first place. As I shut the tractor down near sunset, my neighbor Earl pulled his truck into the driveway carrying 2 cold bottles of root beer. Earl had farmed the next section over for nearly 40 years, and he understood land the way old sailors understand the ocean. After watching the camera footage inside my workshop, he slowly shook his head and said something I never forgot. People stop seeing fences when nobody reminds them why they exist. His words stayed with me all weekend. Early Monday morning, I drove to the county engineering office for a scheduled meeting that had nothing to do with Brenda and everything to do with drainage improvements I had been planning since the previous harvest. Spring storms had become heavier over the last several seasons, and standing water collected along the eastern edge often delayed planting. The engineers spread survey maps across the conference table, pointed toward the exact section where the repeated tire tracks crossed, and explained that a properly graded drainage trench would solve the runoff problem before the next rainy season. As he traced the proposed line with his pencil, I looked at the map and quietly realized that the same area everyone insisted on driving across was about to become an active construction zone designed entirely for protecting the farm. The county moved faster than I expected. Within a week, bright orange survey flags stretched across the eastern edge of my property, marking the future drainage trench with careful precision. An engineer walked the field beside me carrying rolled maps under one arm while explaining grades, water flow, and erosion control. The damp breeze carried the smell of fresh clover as we measured elevations that most people would never notice. To anyone else, it looked like an ordinary construction project. To me, it was another investment in keeping my family's farm productive for the next generation. Before the equipment ever arrived, every permit had been approved, every utility had been marked, and every document sat neatly inside a binder on the passenger seat of my truck. I had learned long ago that farming was not just about working hard. It was about keeping records that spoke for you long after conversations were forgotten. The excavation crew started early on a Monday morning. The steady rumble of the tracked excavator echoed across the valley while fresh earth rolled away from the bucket in smooth, controlled movements. Rich brown soil filled the air with that unmistakable scent you only find after ground that has rested for decades is finally opened. By lunchtime, the shallow drainage channel had already taken shape, following the exact line approved by the county survey. It was never intended to stop traffic. Its purpose was simple: move storm water away from the crops before it could drown another season of work. Once the trench was complete, the contractor installed temporary construction barriers at every approach. Reflective orange fencing stretched between steel posts. Large warning signs read active construction area. No vehicle access. Flashing amber lights automatically switched on at dusk. Even the county inspector commented that the safety measures exceeded the minimum requirements. I thanked him, signed the inspection sheet, and slipped another copy into my growing binder. The following morning, I was repairing an irrigation valve when I heard the familiar growl of Brenda's Escalade slowing near the property line. Instead of driving across immediately, she stopped beside the new barrier and lowered her window. Her oversized sunglasses reflected the flashing warning lights while she looked over the construction area with obvious annoyance. She called across the field and asked how long I planned to keep the road closed. I calmly explained that it had never been a road, only private farmland undergoing a permitted drainage improvement. She frowned as though I had personally inconvenienced her morning schedule. Then she pointed toward the county road visible less than a quarter-mile away and said it added unnecessary time to her commute. I simply wished her a good morning and returned to tightening the irrigation fitting. After a long pause, she drove away using the public road for the first time in weeks. I honestly hoped that was the end of it. Unfortunately, confidence has a strange way of returning when people convince themselves that rules exist only until they become inconvenient. 2 days later, one of my trail cameras recorded Brenda stopping again at the edge of the property. She stepped out, looked at the warning signs, walked around the temporary barrier without touching anything, and spent several minutes studying the construction area before leaving. Watching the footage that evening gave me an uneasy feeling I could not quite explain. She was not confused. She clearly understood something had changed. What worried me was the expression on her face. It was the same determined look I had seen every time she ignored my requests before. The weather forecast predicted 3 straight days of steady spring rain beginning Friday night. By Thursday afternoon, the sky already carried low gray clouds that muted the sunlight across the fields. I finished checking the drainage trench one final time, confirmed every warning light was working, and replaced 2 reflective markers that strong wind had loosened. Standing there in the cool evening air, listening to distant thunder rolling beyond the hills, I looked across the quiet farm and realized everything was finally ready. The land was prepared for the rain. The paperwork was complete. The cameras were recording. From that moment forward, whatever happened would depend entirely on the choices people made after seeing every warning placed directly in front of them. Rain arrived exactly the way the forecast promised. It started with a soft tapping against the metal roof just after sunset, then settled into a slow, steady rhythm that lasted through the night. By dawn, the entire farm carried that rich scent of soaked earth that every farmer recognizes immediately. Water collected in the low spots exactly as the county engineer predicted, but this time it never lingered. The new drainage trench guided the runoff smoothly along its planned route, carrying excess water away from the soybean field before it could drown the young plants. I stood beneath the porch roof with a mug of hot coffee warming my hands while listening to water moving through the channel. It was one of those quiet moments that reminded me why preparation always beats panic. The trench was already proving its value before the project was even fully finished. Around 7:30, I drove my utility vehicle along the construction area to inspect the barriers. Every reflective sign was still standing. The flashing amber lights had switched off automatically with the sunrise. The orange fencing remained stretched tightly between the steel posts despite the overnight wind. I took photographs from every angle, partly for my construction records, and partly because experience had taught me that careful documentation often became the difference between facts and arguments. Before leaving, I checked each trail camera to confirm they were recording properly. Fresh memory cards, full batteries, clear views of every possible entrance. Nothing had been left to chance. The county road remained completely open, paved, and easy to travel despite the rain. It added only a few minutes to any commute, yet I still found myself wondering whether convenience would once again outweigh common sense. Shortly after 8 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a weather alert warning of saturated ground conditions across the county. I smiled because that was exactly why the drainage improvement had been approved in the first place. Healthy farmland depends on moving water where it belongs instead of pretending it will simply disappear on its own. While I was finishing maintenance on an irrigation pump near the equipment shed, Earl pulled into the driveway carrying 2 breakfast sandwiches from the small diner in town. We leaned against the tailgate of his pickup, watching clouds drift slowly across the valley. He looked toward the eastern field and nodded with quiet approval. The trench blended naturally into the landscape now, looking less like fresh construction and more like something that had always belonged there. Earl chuckled and said that Mother Nature usually settled arguments better than lawyers ever could. I laughed, but I also reminded him that the only thing I wanted was for everyone to use the public road and leave the farm alone. He tipped his cap, wished me luck, and headed home before another light shower rolled across the hills. Around 8:15, the familiar low rumble of a large sport utility vehicle echoed faintly through the damp morning air. Even before I saw it, I recognized the sound. Brenda's white Escalade appeared at the far edge of the property and slowed near the construction barriers. She stopped for nearly a full minute. Through the camera later, I would see her looking from the warning signs to the trench, then toward the county road only a short distance away. Everything she needed to make a safe decision was right in front of her. Bright signs, orange fencing, flashing markers still visible in the gray morning light. A perfectly usable public roadway. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was confusing. From where I stood several hundred yards away, I could not hear what she was saying inside her vehicle, but I watched her grip the steering wheel and sit motionless as rainwater dripped steadily from the branches above. Something about that pause felt different from every other morning. It was not hesitation born from uncertainty. It looked more like someone deciding whether the rules applied to them today. I quietly reached into my jacket pocket, opened the camera app on my phone, and noted the exact time. Then I looked back toward the field, the trench carrying rainwater exactly as it had been designed to do, and waited to see which choice would speak louder than every warning already placed in plain sight. Brenda made her decision with a slow press of the accelerator. The white Escalade rolled forward a few feet, stopped again, then eased around the first temporary barrier without touching it. She was not avoiding an obstacle she had failed to notice. She was deliberately navigating around something clearly placed in her path. The reflective warning signs remained standing on both sides of the entrance, their black lettering still easy to read against the gray morning sky. The orange construction fencing stretched across the old shortcut exactly where it had been since the county inspector signed off on the project. I watched from the edge of my equipment shed as the SUV continued creeping toward the eastern field, its tires leaving shallow tracks across ground that had absorbed nearly 2 inches of rain during the previous 36 hours. The soft hum of the engine drifted across the wet pasture, mixing with the steady sound of water flowing through the new drainage channel. My first instinct was to wave her down again, but I stopped myself. Every conversation we had ever shared ended exactly the same way. Every warning had already been given. Every sign had already been installed. Every reasonable alternative remained available. The county road sat less than a quarter-mile away, dry enough for normal traffic and completely open. I reached into my truck, opened the binder containing every permit, inspection report, survey map, and construction photograph, then set it on the passenger seat where I could reach it if needed. Something told me those documents were about to become more important than ever. The trail camera mounted on the old oak tree quietly recorded every second without interruption. I knew its clock matched the timestamp on my phone because I had synchronized them myself the previous evening. Little details like that mattered whenever facts were questioned later. Brenda continued following the same diagonal path she had driven dozens of times before, but the field beneath her wheels was no longer the dry spring soil she remembered. The rain had transformed the upper layer into dark, saturated ground that looked firm from a distance while hiding softer soil underneath. That was exactly why the county approved the drainage improvement. Water always changed the way land behaved. Farmers respected that reality because ignoring it usually became expensive. About halfway across the field, the Escalade slowed noticeably. I could see the front tires sending thin ribbons of wet mud outward instead of rolling cleanly over the surface. She paused for only a second before pressing forward again, apparently convinced momentum would solve the problem. It carried her several more yards until the vehicle reached the section beside the newly excavated drainage trench where runoff had been flowing steadily since dawn. The ground there had done exactly what every engineer expected saturated soil to do. It became softer than the surrounding field while safely directing excess water away from the crops. I heard the engine rev slightly higher, followed by the unmistakable sound of tires spinning against wet earth. The vehicle stopped moving forward. Instead, the wheels began polishing the mud beneath them into a smooth, slick surface. Brenda tried reversing, then moving forward again. Each attempt settled the heavy sport utility vehicle a little deeper into the softened ground without bringing it anywhere near the drainage channel itself. It was not submerged, damaged, or overturned. It simply no longer had enough traction to continue. The engine noise faded as she finally lifted her foot from the accelerator. For several long seconds, the farm became quiet again, except for birds calling from the fence line and water trickling through the trench exactly as designed. Brenda stepped out carefully, looked first at the tires, then at the warning signs she had driven past only moments earlier. Even from a distance, I could recognize the expression on her face. It was the look people wear when reality refuses to cooperate with assumptions they have repeated for far too long. I walked toward her at an unhurried pace, boots sinking lightly into the damp grass instead of the softened field. Before saying a single word, I glanced once toward the blinking trail camera mounted in the oak tree. It had captured every warning, every choice, and every second leading to that quiet morning moment when convenience finally met the simple laws of weather, engineering, and private property. Brenda looked at me as though I had somehow arranged for the weather itself to inconvenience her. Water dripped steadily from the hem of her expensive jacket while the Escalade rested motionless behind her. Its tires settled harmlessly into the saturated soil without any sign of damage beyond a coating of thick Missouri mud. The steady trickle of runoff moving through the drainage trench was louder now after another brief shower had passed overhead, and the cool air carried the clean scent of wet earth instead of the usual dust that followed her morning shortcut. She threw both hands into the air and asked if I was planning to help her. I answered honestly. I told her I would gladly call a towing company if she wanted professional assistance, but I was not willing to drive heavy equipment across freshly saturated ground because doing so could damage the crops and create an even larger problem. She frowned, glanced toward the tractor parked near my equipment shed, and insisted it would only take a minute. I quietly explained that tractors are designed for farm work, not vehicle recovery, and that using one without the proper equipment could create unnecessary risks for everyone involved. My answer clearly was not the one she expected. She pulled out her phone and began making calls while pacing carefully along the edge of the field. I could not hear every word, but I caught enough to understand that she believed the county should somehow hold me responsible because there was now a trench where she preferred to drive. Less than 20 minutes later, a deputy from the sheriff's office arrived, followed shortly afterward by a county road supervisor who happened to be inspecting storm drainage projects nearby. The deputy greeted both of us politely before asking what had happened. I simply handed him my binder. Inside were the construction permits, inspection reports, survey maps, photographs showing every warning sign in place before the rain, and copies of previous reports documenting repeated trespassing across the property. He thanked me, then walked the area slowly, reading each reflective sign and examining the temporary barriers that still stood exactly where they had been installed. The county supervisor did much the same thing. He studied the drainage trench, nodded several times, and confirmed that everything matched the approved construction plans. Brenda insisted the shortcut had been used for months and claimed everyone considered it part of the neighborhood. The deputy listened patiently before asking a simple question. Had anyone ever granted a legal easement across the farm? The answer was no. The property records confirmed it. The survey stakes confirmed it. My deed confirmed it. Convenience had never created a public road. While the discussion continued, the towing company finally arrived with a heavy recovery truck specially equipped for muddy conditions. The operator stepped out, walked around the Escalade once, and smiled politely. He explained that the recovery would take some time because he wanted to avoid causing additional damage to the soft field. Wide recovery mats were placed beneath the equipment, and every movement was slow and deliberate. Watching experienced professionals work reminded me why preparation always matters. About an hour later, the vehicle rolled safely back onto the paved county road covered in mud, but otherwise unharmed. As the driver finished his paperwork, the deputy asked whether I wished to file a formal trespassing complaint based on the documented history. I paused for a moment before answering. I told him my first priority had always been protecting the farm, not punishing neighbors. However, I did want the repeated unauthorized access officially documented so there would be no confusion in the future. He nodded, completed his report, and reminded Brenda that private property boundaries applied regardless of how often someone had ignored them in the past. She said very little after that. Before leaving, the county supervisor complimented the drainage project, pointing out that despite the heavy rain, The soybean field itself remained well protected because the new trench had carried the runoff exactly as intended. I stood quietly beside the fence after everyone drove away, listening to the fading sound of engines disappear down the public road that had always been available. The only fresh tracks left in my field that afternoon belonged to the recovery crew working carefully to protect the land, and somehow that simple difference meant more to me than winning any argument ever could. The next few days were quieter than any I had experienced since the first tire tracks crossed my field, but the silence did not mean the story was over. It simply meant the paperwork had begun. The deputy's report was officially filed, the county inspection notes were added to the construction records, and my trail camera footage was copied onto 2 separate storage drives before I placed one inside my office safe. My father always believed that memories belong in your heart, but evidence belongs in a folder. Looking through those recordings one evening, I realized they told a complete story without anyone raising their voice. Every warning sign was visible. Every barrier remained in place. Every decision had been voluntary. There was something strangely reassuring about facts that spoke for themselves. A week later, I received a letter from Brenda's insurance company requesting photographs, permit documentation, and a description of the construction project. Instead of writing an emotional response, I mailed copies of exactly what they requested along with the county approval, inspection reports, dated photographs of the warning signs, and still images from the trail cameras showing the barriers standing exactly where they belonged before the incident occurred. I did not speculate. I did not accuse anyone. I simply organized the facts in chronological order and sent them by certified mail. About 2 weeks after that, another envelope arrived, this time confirming that the company had completed its review. According to their findings, the construction project had been properly permitted and clearly marked, and there was no indication that the property owner had created an unexpected hazard. Reading those words felt less like a victory and more like quiet confirmation that careful preparation had mattered. Around the same time, several residents from Willow Creek Estates began stopping by the farm, not to argue, but to apologize. Most admitted they had only heard one version of the shortcut story. They assumed the route had always been available because they had watched Brenda use it so confidently. After seeing the deputy's report circulate through the neighborhood and learning that the county had approved every part of the drainage project months in advance, many realized they had accepted assumptions instead of facts. One retired schoolteacher even brought me a homemade peach pie and apologized for never questioning what she had been told. We spent nearly an hour talking beside the old equipment barn while swallows darted through the evening sky. It reminded me how quickly misunderstandings grow whenever nobody bothers to verify them. The monthly homeowners association meeting took place before the end of the month, and although I was not a member, several neighbors later described what happened. The discussion reportedly lasted nearly 2 hours. Questions were raised about encouraging residents to cross land that had never belonged to the association. Copies of county maps and property records were reviewed. Someone even projected aerial photographs showing the public road only a short distance away. By the end of the meeting, the proposed community access idea had quietly disappeared from future agendas. I did not celebrate when I heard that. I simply returned to checking irrigation lines the next morning because crops never pause for neighborhood politics. The drainage trench continued doing exactly what engineers designed it to do. Another heavy rain arrived before the end of spring, and instead of watching water pool across the eastern field, I watched it move steadily through the channel before disappearing into the natural drainage system beyond the property line. The soybean rows stayed healthy, the soil remained stable, and for the first time in months there were no fresh tire tracks cutting diagonally across the crops. Sometimes I would stop near the fence after finishing evening chores and look toward the county road where traffic flowed normally. Drivers reached their destinations just fine without crossing anyone else's land. That simple sight reminded me how often the easiest legal solution had been available all along. Looking back now, the most important lesson had nothing to do with mud, machinery, or expensive vehicles. It was that patience backed by preparation is stronger than frustration backed by assumptions. Every permit, every photograph, every warning sign, and every calm conversation became another brick in a foundation built on facts instead of emotion. When the questions finally came, I never needed the loudest voice because the evidence had already answered them. Some are settled over the farm with the slow confidence that only comes after a season of hard work done the right way. Every morning, I walk the same eastern boundary carrying my coffee, but now the only marks across the field belong to deer wandering through before sunrise and the narrow tracks from my own tractor during scheduled maintenance. The soybean plants had filled in beautifully, covering the places that once seemed impossible to repair. Standing there in the early light, breathing in the scent of warm soil and fresh leaves while red-winged blackbirds called from the fence line, I realized the land had quietly done what it always does. Given enough care and enough patience, it healed. The drainage trench blended naturally into the landscape, carrying away storm water so efficiently that several neighboring farmers stopped by during the season just to ask about the design. I gladly shared the county engineering plans and explained what had worked because good ideas become even better when they help more than one family. A few months after everything happened, I saw Brenda again for the first time since that rainy morning. She was driving along the paved county road, exactly where everyone had been able to drive all along. She slowed briefly as she passed the entrance to my farm, looked toward the fence line, then continued without turning in. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting across property lines, and no final argument waiting to happen. Sometimes the strongest ending is simply watching people make better choices than they made before. I honestly hope that is what happened. Life is too short to spend every season fighting with neighbors when respect costs nothing. Looking back, people often ask whether I felt satisfied watching that expensive vehicle become stuck in the muddy field. The truth usually surprises them. I never wanted anyone's day to go that way. I never built the drainage trench because of Brenda, and I certainly never wanted anyone to ignore the warning signs that had been placed there for their own safety. What brought me peace was something much simpler. The permits mattered. The photographs mattered. The conversations stayed respectful. The evidence stayed organized. Every decision I made was based on protecting the farm instead of trying to defeat another person. That difference shaped everything that followed. My grandfather used to say that land has a way of revealing character. Some people see boundaries and respect them. Others see boundaries and immediately begin searching for exceptions. In the end, the ground treated everyone exactly the same. It responded to rain, gravity, engineering, and the choices people made after seeing the truth right in front of them. That lesson has stayed with me far longer than the memory of muddy tire tracks ever will. Even today, the binder containing every permit, inspection report, photograph, and deputy report still sits on a shelf inside my office. I rarely open it anymore, but I keep it there as a reminder that preparation is never wasted, honesty never goes out of style, and quiet persistence usually outlasts loud confidence. Whenever storms roll across the valley now, I stand on the porch listening to rainwater moving smoothly through the drainage channel instead of worrying about flooded crops or fresh shortcuts across the field. The farm is peaceful again, and that peace is worth more than winning any argument. If there is one thing I hope this experience leaves behind, it is that respecting someone else's property is not just about following the law. It is about recognizing the years of work, sacrifice, and family history that stand behind every fence, every field, and every gate. So now I would genuinely like to hear from you. What do you think about the way everything unfolded? Would you have handled the situation differently? Or do you believe patience, preparation, and clear documentation were the right approach from the beginning? Share your thoughts in the comments because I always enjoy reading different perspectives. And if stories like this remind you that calm decisions and honest actions can still make a difference, I hope you will consider subscribing and joining us for more real-world stories where respect, common sense, and perseverance speak louder than anger ever could. As for me, every sunrise across this farm still carries the same quiet reminder. Justice does not have to be loud. Sometimes it simply waits, stays prepared, and lets the truth arrive on its own time.